Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to the person who's asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, today's Question of Doom is actually the first video filmed in the new Archaeosoup Towers. The new set took a little bit of a while to set up, and it's not that different from the old one. There are a few additions, but I'm feeling very much at home already. Indeed, for the next couple of weeks, Mrs. Soup is actually off work, so together we're going to be laying out the house, setting up things. It's been a wonderfully exciting time. And like I say, we're not half done yet. Nonetheless, today I really wanted to answer this question sent in by Anna. Now, Anna wrote this. Dear Mr. Soup, I have a friend who has trouble reading. They have dyslexia. And actually so do I, Anna. I also have dyslexia. I am currently learning about evolution in school, and this has got me thinking. Why haven't brain problems or malfunctions, like dyslexia, been bred out of existence through natural selection? I asked my biology teacher, but she didn't want to answer my question. Can you explain? Thank you, Anna. That's a very good question, Anna. And I can understand why your teacher maybe didn't want to explain. I remember asking similar questions in high school, and well, I was often told to shut up because you're there to learn essentially for a very specific curriculum. And sometimes these questions on the edge can maybe distract the class. So you shouldn't think too poorly of your teacher. Maybe she was just having an off day, but. Again, you ask a very, very interesting question, and actually you frame it in a very interesting way, because you call brains that behave in a certain way malfunctioning, and I suspect this comes from the sort of the post-computer world that we live in. Indeed, you're probably watching this video on a computer, where we think often as computers of being electronic or mechanical brains, and as brains of being biological computers. The terminology is sort of crossed and interbred, and we've come up with this new hybrid of a brain as a thinking machine. And in that sense, often we think when it's not working properly, and when we think it's not working properly, as it were, I'll come back to that in a moment, we will say it's malfunctioning. That's a very interesting term. In the past, people with certain problems, especially problems which led to them being antisocial in some way, would have been treated very, very harshly, maybe sent to prisons or workhouses, or maybe even they'd actually be lobotomized. People, for example, if society decided actually that's just too much hassle to live with, they would be incapacitated in one way or another. So in some ways today we're extraordinarily lucky, especially in Britain, very lucky to be able to treat, but also just to be, as it were. If one has a brain that works slightly differently, it's much easier now to find ways to live than it ever has been, certainly in the past couple of 100 years. But that does not mean that it's always been that way. You see, perhaps these brains which you say are malfunctioning are actually brains which are simply out of their context, they're out of their element. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, our society is very young. I don't know, at a maximum 1,000 years, but probably much, much younger than that, I imagine, if you wanted to say, let's say, early modern, so 1700s onwards. Quite a young society in that sense. But human beings, human brains have been around for 200,000 years at least. Homo sapiens have, that is to say, our species. And in that sense, that length of time, that's what, 0.5% of our time on this planet. So actually, in some respects, having a brain which isn't suited to modern society doesn't necessarily mean it's not working right. It means that maybe it was a brain that was very useful at some other point in that 99.5% of our time on this planet, in those 200,000 years. Now, there have been studies done by anthropologists, psychologists, archaeologists and others which have suggested that people with common brain disorders, if we want to use that term, may actually be very well adapted to other ways of living or other societies. So, for example, it's been suggested that someone maybe with bipolar disorder would find it much easier to be active when they had to be, maybe in the summer, and then maybe to go into almost like a state of hibernation in the winter. You may have heard of SAD, seasonally affected disorder, and possibly this is almost like a human hibernation state. Not literally hibernating, but it means that you're less likely to feel the need to do something when you can't. And then in the summer, maybe you're on a high, and you're able to run around, being active, gathering resources, meeting partners, so on and so forth. So some of this stuff, actually, even though today it's branded as a disorder, may have in the past actually served an evolutionary advantage. It may have served a purpose, and that's why it's still with us today. Indeed, well, I will come back to that. Another example might be, say, people with short attention spans. Today, it is a bit of a problem. There's so much in the world that we live in that we've created for ourselves, especially in places like Britain, which is a distraction to people who have attention deficit disorders, ADHD, this kind of thing. For example, over in that side of my office, I've got my collection of geeky toys, things like a Doctor Who TARDIS and comic books and all this kind of thing, and that's very distracting. Now, if I had ADHD, I don't think I'd be able to sit here for this long without actually wanting to really go and play with those things. I almost want to all the time anyway. But that wouldn't be my problem. That wouldn't be my fault. That would actually be essentially the problem of having so much stimulation around. Whereas in the past, say in the Paleolithic, or at some other point in history, maybe when there was a little bit less in the way of stimulation, someone who had attention deficit disorders or whatever terminology you want to use, they might have been the snappy thinkers, always coming up with new ideas, being less than content with just looking at the campfire. Maybe they were constantly thinking about other things, running around, having moments of inspiration. This again is a vital element of the reason why human beings have been successful as a species. What about, say, people on the autistic spectrum? Again, it's been suggested in one paper in particular that maybe if people in the past were just not on the autistic spectrum, we wouldn't have been as successful. That is to say that someone who doesn't feel the need to socialise quite so much, someone who sees the world in a slightly more logistic, objective way, someone who is inspired by patterns and inspired to follow patterns, may have been crucial, absolutely crucial in, for example, getting through, say, the Ice Age, in managing resources, in being able to survive when maybe you can't feed the whole group, so this person goes off on their own because they're quite happy being on their own. People on the autistic spectrum, again, don't necessarily have a malfunctioning brain. They may well have been some of the best survivors of all time in the past. It just so happens that we've created a society where, well, we make it difficult for them. Public transport, again, an overabundance of information to take in and to be awed by. The fact that people insist on having eye contact, for example. These things are very difficult for people on that spectrum. But in the past, maybe their way of thinking, their way of viewing the world, their way of communicating would have been, again, very, very useful in ways which have directly contributed to our society and our species being here today. Finally, I suppose looking at dyslexia, again, the thing that I struggled with, well, if you think about it, the written word, which is really what dyslexics tend to get confused by, has only really been around for the past few thousand years. Let's say 3,000, 3 to 5,000 years, a bit more than that. Depending on what kind of writing you're talking about, if you see what I mean. Anyway, written words have only been around for a little bit of our time on this planet. But for all the time before that, the dyslexic brain didn't have to struggle with words. And actually what we tend to find in, say, modern society is that dyslexia often means that the person who has to come up with, say, mechanisms of coping with not being able to read words very well. They're very creative in that sense. They get around these problems. Many entrepreneurs are dyslexic. Many people who are very, very creative have problems with words and numbers. And again, in the past, it wouldn't have been an issue. There wouldn't have been letters to confuse those brains, to confuse this brain. So, so maybe brains like that are simply brains which are slightly out of their context. We've forced the society on these brains, which isn't necessarily the best one for them. Now, I do know what you mean, though. It is tempting to think, well, in that sense, why hadn't this environmental pressure acted on these types of brains and made it less likely for them to be passed on, these tendencies to flourish in society? Well, the answer to that is quite complicated, but on the one hand, it's because, well, again, we haven't really had this type of pressure on our society, on humanity, for that long at all, really, in terms of the evolutionary clock. But also, as well, the inheritance of these things is complicated. You can inherit these tendencies through recessive genes. So maybe people who aren't dyslexic, they can actually have a child who is, this kind of thing. So it's not a direct, you can't just say, let us not breed with anyone who is dyslexic. Because if you do, well, that's not going to stop the dyslexia from being around in the gene pool. There's also other things such as, for example, some people suggest the types of food that we eat now, the food processes that we have, the preservatives, all this kind of thing, the pollution in the environment. Maybe these are factors which affect one's tendencies and whether or not one may well develop a malfunctioning brain, as it were. It's also worthwhile remembering, though, that this idea of breeding out undesirable attributes is one which goes down I suppose almost like the line of eugenics. This is the idea, for example, the Nazis were big fans of, that you can mold societies and you can actually get rid of undesirable attributes through, say, for example, selective breeding. It's an aggressive form of Darwinian evolution and determinism in that sense. But you need to remember, though, that actually a healthy gene pool is a wide gene pool, and not only can you not, get rid of all undesirable genes, because not all of them will be obvious on the surface. For example, I'm probably carrying genes from all sorts of different types of people. I'm just not using them all in my physicality right now. Not only can you not do that, but also actually having variability is, well, it's vital. It's a beautiful and vital thing for a successful species. In other words, you need the capacity for mutation, and you need the capacity to have difference in your species. Otherwise, your species dies out. So maybe getting rid of malfunctioning brains isn't a good idea. So, Anna, hopefully this answer has somewhat surprised you, in so much as perhaps these brains aren't malfunctioning at all. Maybe the problem is our fairly narrow society with its strict expectations in terms of social norms, the ability, say, to read and write, the need to conform to certain societal structures in terms of infrastructure and how one gets about. Maybe our society actually is possibly a bit of the problem in this instance, and maybe these brains are actually simply differently adapted. And that is a brilliant thing. It means actually that our species is, still undergoing evolution, but also that we have the capacity to adapt to future challenges as and when they turn up. If all words disappeared tomorrow, I would be very happy, and I'd probably thrive. Anyway, hopefully this has gone some way to I don't know, helping you to think about this topic, and also maybe this goes some way to answering the question as to why it is your biology teacher didn't want to necessarily go into detail. It's a complicated question with a complicated answer, but hopefully you found this useful. If you guys out there have any comments or thoughts, please do comment below. I would love to read them, and I'm sure Anna would as well. Well, as ever, until next time, do take care. Bye bye.